So hello, I want to welcome you guys today and thank you for joining us. So a little background first. My name is Corey Matthews. I'm the Offensive Security Manager here at Critical Start. So I oversee the red team operations on the penetration testing and research, things like that. Over 8 years in the industry. Before this, I did digital forensics, incident response, vulnerability management, moved into penetration testing and research. I focus a lot of my research in embedded hardware, embedded devices, things like that, IoT, and building start. Joffrey?
Hi guys, I'm Joffrey Alexander. I'm part of the Critical Start Digital Forensics and Incident Response team. It's a new professional services offering that Critical Start offered at the beginning of this year, or very late last year. I have over 4 years experience in the information security industry. The roles have ranged from security operations, like a SOC analyst, incident response. I'm doing digital forensics. Prior to that, I have an additional 4 years in IT. I was doing networking, system administration, and implementations as well. And the fun fact about me, I like tennis a lot, and I also try to play occasionally.
Today we are going over exploiting passwords. So within an enterprise or domain at an organization, large organizations. And really how, as malicious actors or as, the red team, we come in, we would, from an external side, how do we gather these passwords? What steps are we taking to gather sets of credentials? How do we trick people into doing that? And then how do we abuse them after the fact? Then we'll move into doing the same thing once on an internal network, to doing an internal penetration test, just so cover all the bases here, and we'll be covering not only the offensive side of this, but also the defensive side. And that's why, myself and Joffrey are both here. That way we can kind of, two sides of the same coin. So for a step here, how do bad guys do this? How do we grab things externally? So one of the obvious ways here is using phishing. That is something that happens constantly. It's always happening in the wild, and I don't feel that it will ever go away. This can be something as simple as a login page where, someone asks for your username and password, or it can be something fairly advanced. And I'll give an example here shortly about, how we use things like this, some success stories in terms of how we use phishing engagements or phishing in our offensive security engagements. Another thing that came up a little bit earlier this year was a Zoom vulnerability when everyone started working from home. And I say vulnerability. It was a way to abuse UNC paths, so a file path over a network that allowed you to capture credentials or capture hashes. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Password spraying, generally back in the day was, brute forcing passwords, a list of email addresses and a list of passwords. But, defensive side has advanced to the point where typically you catch something like that. But there are other ways to do things that are a little more intelligent, a little more stealthy. And of course, anytime there's a breach dump announced or a breach announced, we go look for the dumps. Sometimes that means, going to some shady parts of the internet, going on a forum or something somewhere and downloading files and hoping it's actually passwords in there. We can use those, search for them, any of our targets, our clients that are in there. We have actually a blog post about this, weaponizing breach dumps, where we build out a system that will store them using server that will make it easy for us to search for them and actually implement them on a per client basis during a pen test. And then some other general things to mention there. OSINT, so looking on Pastebin, GitHub, people still do leave passwords in GitHub. Even if you wipe it out, there's still change logs, there's still history, you can still look back. So it's very important to make sure that all of those are wiped out. Social engineering, yes, that does cover phishing as well, but also calling people, doing phishing or smishing. And then exploiting technical vulnerabilities to have a application or a system give you either plain text passwords or potentially a password hash. So that's gathering the credentials there. So how do we use them externally? How do we exploit them or abuse them? So logging into products that are facing externally, like OA, Office 365, maybe a VPN connection, file sharing services such as Dropbox or Google Drive, accessing any kind of externally exposed Azure. So if you have, like, say, a hybrid Azure deployment for your Active Directories. And also, if you just want to be malicious about it, go lock people out of their accounts just to do the damage and not necessarily get anything out of it other than creating problems.
So the next step is, how do you prevent bad guys like Corey from getting and abusing your passwords? So a lot of the defenses around the external gathering side of things rely on a lot of open source intelligence. So generally in large organizations, this responsibility will be for threat intelligence teams. But if you're a smaller org and you don't have that, you can conduct regular scrapes against sites like Shodan, Census.io for IoT devices. Like he was saying on Pastebin, Hastebin, GitHub, Control-C. So a lot of the times, developers and people who contribute to open source projects or whatever, they will paste source code directly to these sites. And inside this code, there are sometimes credentials that they, unknowingly have pasted to the public internet. So, this is a very common way for people to scrape these sites related specifically to your corporate domain, your corporate email addresses, and get those credentials and try to use them once they are in your network. Now, another good way, if you're a smaller organization, to do this is the reliance on a threat intelligence platform. So these automated scrapes can actually be configured in these threat intelligence platforms, and it's also can be modified specifically for your industry or vertical. So this is really heavily used in the industries like banking and finance, oil and gas, healthcare, and defense contracting, because a lot of the threat actors, once they target those verticals, that's kind of their wheelhouse. And when you have more vertical-oriented threat intelligence, it's a much higher fidelity of indicators that you can pass down to your detection team. So the next part is the defenses against external credential exploitation and abuse, right? So when Corey was talking about OWA is a pretty big target for attackers. It's a browser only, right? So I don't have to compromise your endpoint, your desktop, or whatever. All I have to do is figure out a way to get your credentials, and I can be sitting halfway across the world and log into your mailbox, right? And I can start monitoring all of your internal corporate email, seeing all the people you communicate with, and start sending them phishes if I want to gather even more credentials. So one of the good things about OWA is it actually logs the user agents with people when people what people log in with, right? So you can conduct a pretty healthy amount of user agent analysis based on your users' regular login habits. Let's say if they do use the web client a lot, versus someone sitting halfway across the world, you're probably going to see a totally different user agent, and that's how you can find some anomalous logins. Also, the obvious, right? Limiting geolocations and alerting on anomalous OWA logins. And that can all be set up in O365 depending on your subscription level. But those are things and alerts that 100% need to be paid attention to, because I believe the last factoid I read regarding ransomware for 2020 was 92% of ransomware attacks start with a phishing email. So those alerts are something that you have to pay attention to as an enterprise. VPNs VPNs can be configured using ACLs, and they can be configured to only allow logins from specific IPs, a specific IP range if they're getting their IP from an ISP and it's only going to be within one block. Or additionally, you can also limit VPN logins based on geolocation. So if your employees are only in North America or only in Chicago, in the central region of the United States, you can have it to where they can only log in from that area. And travel allowances for these employees need to be managed and tracked by our help desk. And this is a pretty big thing when my team is coming in and doing post-incident response, or even during an incident. This is additional data that we can correlate and to use and weed out false positives when it comes to anomalous VPN logins. So if you can do that, you'll be definitely one step ahead of the game. And the last thing is Azure AD hardening. And this kind of goes back to it's in the similar vein of the OWA anomalous login monitoring, in that you can set specific alerts in Azure AD sign-ins like impossible travel logons. So for example, if I'm logging in from LA and then 15 minutes later I have a Azure Active Directory sign-in from Thailand, then it's not going to let that Thailand login successfully authenticate, because it'll say, well, how did you get from point A to point B in that short amount of time? So that's a really good rule, an alerting rule that you can set up, and that'll put you one step ahead of the game there.
So Joffrey covered kind of the defenses there, and we'll dive a little more in depth on each thing as we're going through in terms of what the bad guys can do versus what the defense side of the blue team can do, in maybe stopping it, or even if you can't stop it, at least detect it. That way you can do something about it, be a little more proactive instead of finding it 3 months later when all of a sudden something really bad happens. So this is more of a kind of a generic phishing discussion right now here. This landing page that's on the slide, this is an example from something we use during our phishing engagements on a pen test. This is actually a fairly successful one we've used before. We buy up these domains that look like it's something along the lines of Microsoft or Office or something like that. Make them look very professional. And as you see on the slide there, sometimes we misspell things on purpose. Just to throw people off, maybe, we want to make a couple of phishing emails, make one of them look more phishing, and then follow up with some less obvious that are, maybe they're pointing out a previous phishing email and pretending to be someone from an IT department internally or someone from a security department internally to try to build that trust with the user. But this campaign that we launched, this was actually earlier this year, was pretty interesting, because if you click on the left button there that says use Microsoft Office, that will take you to just kind of a cloned page of a Microsoft login. If you enter your credentials, obviously then we will have your username and password. However, if you click on the right side there to get a passcode, it imitates a multi-factor authentication or a 2FA type of situation where it will send you to another page and will give you a blank box and say, hey, we're going to send you another email. It will have a code. Please enter the code into this box, and then you can move forward. It doesn't really matter what you enter there. It's going to accept anything. But that also helps build that confidence in our target, right? So as a user, you're like, oh, well, this looks professional. It looks on the level. Let's do this. Either way you go here, either we get the username password, or if you go through the passcode style, it will always lead you to a point where we offer, downloading a document or downloading a payload. And there's many fun tricks we can go to from there. Obviously, we're not going to dive into that today because that is a whole conversation in itself on phishing. But one thing to note here is bringing up UNC paths. So UNC path is, a path to a file share. So when you go to access something, maybe it's on a file server, or a printer or something along those lines on an internal network, there are different ways you can access it. Different formats you have to follow in terms of how you enter things into, let's say, a browser or your file explorer, or maybe you're setting up a service or a software that has to access a remote file share. In some browsers, even these days, you can embed UNC paths within the source code of a site. And here I've pasted in some generic and censored, so it just shows localhost. But these are things, even up until earlier this year, we were able to use with success, because there are still plenty of organizations out there that will force their users into using Internet Explorer as their daily browser. So maybe you have an application, legacy app that has to be used, but will only work with IE. This type of exploit, this type of vector does work with IE for sure. Older versions of different browsers may or may not work. The last time we tested it, we were able to get IE and some older versions of, say, Edge and some of the others to actually send us an NTLM v2 hash on an external facing, SMB server in quotes. So it's just answering that call and saying, hey, yes, I am that network share. I do have this image that you're looking for called test.txt. Send me your hash to make sure that you're a legitimate user and I can load this for you. And so then we would take that hash, go crack it. Now we have your password.
So to touch on the defensive counterpoint against Corey's and their team's, awesome phishing page that they set up, which looks totally legitimate, even to me. So there's defenses against phishing, which you can do. And the best way is it's never one solution. It's never one security tool. It's always a layered approach. So the first thing in that layer generally needs to be, an email security gateway, some type of SMTP filtering, right? So you have your email tenant, whether that be an on-prem Exchange server, whether that be totally in the cloud, Node 365, but in front of that, your email needs to be filtered with some kind of security gateway. And with these enhanced security features within these gateways, you can actually have features such as like URL rewriting, right? So if there's a URL in the body of the email, you'll actually rewrite the URL and reroute it back to that email security gateway's architecture and sandbox that URL just to ensure that nothing malicious is happening. There's also attachment sandboxing. So, instead of the email coming directly from the outside directly onto the user's mailbox, the actual attachments will get sandboxed at the edge, and then only items without any malicious verdicts will be able to pass through. And then you as security administrators can go in and tune that level of granularity you want. There's also spam filtering as well, definitely the obvious one. Another thing that's really helpful for your end users is external email banners, right? So, if I were to spoof the sender address of an email with your company's domain name, or with like an @gmail.com with your CEO's name, if there's a banner on that email saying, hey, this email came from the outside, your end user is going to be alerted to that immediately and less likely to do anything that would cause harm. And then another thing that really needs to be implemented is some kind of phishing reporting mechanism, right? So if you're seeing a rash of users see a lot of phishing emails and you have no way of knowing that, then you don't really know when you are, quote unquote, under attack. So if you have a reporting mechanism set up, and actually Office makes it really easy for you to do this, O365, within the mail client itself, you can actually configure like a report phishing email button. So all they have to do is be on that active email, and then one of the icons on the top of the email pane will be report this as a suspicious email. So that is a great way for your end users to communicate directly to your security teams and tell them what threats they're seeing in their mailboxes. Additionally, with the filtering is limit the type of extensions you're allowing through. There's no reason that Visual Basic scripts or JavaScripts or executables or our ISO files, which we've been seeing a lot lately, should be going through email at all. Any of those types of files, if people internally or contractors externally in your organizations need to access that needs to be set up in some kind of secure share. Email is not the way for those things to be transported. And last but not least, for the attachment perspective, limit the macros to people who need them, right? So people in finance and accounting, when security people say disable all macros, well, that's not very realistic to a financial company who has millions of dollars tied up in very highly complex macros, right? But you can, at a minimum, set up some controls around them, So the maintenance guys may necessarily not need the access to those macros and for them to be enabled on their desktop, but people in finance and accounting probably do. So this is just another example of granular controls will really give you the best bet in terms of defenses here. Next, it's DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. SPF basically restricts who can send emails from your domain. DKIM basically ensures that the content of your emails remains trusted and hasn't been tampered with or compromised. And DMARC actually examines the from header and the header of the email and compares the sender's domain name with that. So if there is any kind of header spoofing there, DMARC will be able to capture that. This is a pretty large undertaking. If your organization can do all three, that's great, and that is the preferred method. And last but not least, the most important aspect of protecting against phishing is training users, right? So this can be in the way of phishing simulations, tabletop exercises, even having an external red team like Corey's team come in and do an engagement, because the only way people are going to learn is if you train them. You can have them going through PowerPoint slides or have them read a security policy, and that may just go in one ear and out the other. But if you're sending your users on a regular cadence phishing emails to test them, and then you have some kind of reporting and training mechanism built in around that, they're more and more likely to not want to show up on that list of people that successfully got phished, and they will be more aware. And overall, it just creates for a safer enterprise for you. And no amount of security solutions will ever protect you 100%, as the human factor is always the most easily exploitable, as red team people can tell you. So yeah, just train your people and user awareness. That's the main key here.
That's exactly right. You go through, and the human factor is usually the weakest point, because you can have all of your technologies, everything configured well and locked down, but if I call someone in your accounting department and tell them I'm from IT and ask them for their password and they give it to me, well, that is a huge failure in whether it be education or whatever it may be. But education is huge. And also to kind of side note that, not just a negative reinforcement. When Joffrin touched on setting up a way to report phishing emails and relay that information to, say, an internal security or IT team, that itself is them helping. That is your users helping you create a more secure environment. So really having a culture within an organization that promotes that type of user awareness or that type of secure thinking is paramount. And I see in a lot of places, when I was on a blue team, where the only feedback you would get from a phishing engagement as an employee of an organization may be negative. Say, hey, you clicked on this, now you have to go and sit through this 30-minute training. And as Joffrin said, that goes in one ear and out the other quite often. And whether that's good or bad, or whose fault it is, it doesn't matter. It's up to the organization to make sure that we equip and prepare our employees to help us secure, because it is a partnership amongst everyone within that company. Another way, and kind of going back, like I said, we're going to kind of touch through those points on each kind of way that we're either gathering or abusing these credentials externally as password spamming. Now, like I said earlier, the old days were brute forcing, so we're taking a list of users and a list of passwords and brute forcing them, trying different passwords for different email accounts or different user accounts. The problem there is you'll lock out someone from their mailbox very quickly if you do not know their failure threshold. So what we do now is more what they call a horizontal password spraying. We'll spend a few hours building out a, what we feel is a solid list of user accounts, and say, with OWA or Office 365 or any number of different services we can log into with those, we'll try one super common password. In this instance, what you're seeing in that screenshot, from a phishing engagement, we actually gathered multiple passwords, and more than one happened to be the password change me. As you can see there, they've tried to mix it up there with numbers instead of letters and some special characters. But we saw that as a trend. So if we get a phishing email result that has something unique, but it happens more than once, we're going to say, hey, maybe that's a default setup, right? Change me sounds like a password someone would set when we create your account internally. So we use that as a horizontal password spray. And by that, I mean, we had a huge list of usernames or email addresses, and we used a single password. So we weren't locking out accounts because we were only trying one login attempt on each account, but each one used the same password. On this one, we found a number of different accounts that were actually using that same password, and we were able to compromise quite a few. When it comes to testing these credentials, Microsoft has a lot of neat things built in, especially if you're a sysadmin or as a red teamer. With some of the external facing applications, with Azure deployments, things like that, there are even some built-in PowerShell modules that are official Microsoft offerings that allow you to very easily check, hey, let's connect to this service online. You can download like address list, a global address list, which is very nice for us as the offensive side, because we can log in, dump that address list, and then launch an even more successful phishing campaign against everyone in the organization, and knowing those are valid email addresses. Another way, we find passwords. I actually, for this presentation, searched for this. This is called a Google Dork, right? This is basically a more advanced way to search on a number of different search engines on the internet to find different information than what may show up initially. So here we're looking for database passwords. Yes, I censored out the URL, but there you could very easily go and search these things too and find the same results. But ethically, you want to make sure there's at least some kind of protection. But this is out there. I can throw one of these searches in there, put an organization's name in there, put it in quotes to make sure that it's explicit. Hey, it has to include this search result in everything, or this string in every search result that you provide me. There are a ton of them out there. Thinking about as you're publishing code, as you are putting things out there, maybe you're a service provider and need to send a configuration to a client, but for some reason they do URL filtering and they can't access GitHub, or they can't access a file share, Dropbox or Box from their internal network. So you just put it on a paste bin, send it out and say, hey, here, download this. If you don't delete that paste bin, it's still there. And if that configuration file has passwords or whatever it may be, someone can come through, scrape it, and find it and use it going forward. So that's more the external side. We can now move into an internal. So say we got that initial foothold, or we're coming in doing more of a stealthy red team engagement, if you will. Say we go into a conference room we plug in a Dropbox or something along those lines that allow us to access a network that otherwise we wouldn't be able to access if we were external. So how would we gather any kind of credentials off of that, whether it be your corporate network, a guest Wi-Fi, or some other misconfiguration that allows us to hop on a shared network? We can use something to sniff the hashes off the wire. So by that, talking about tools like Responder, Envy, there's another one that's a little more passive called Flamingo. Finding credentials that are defaults or easy to guess. So maybe this device or this software doesn't have any publicly documented default credentials, but if I guess admin password as the credentials and it logs in, it's pretty easy. It's also something to find them lying about. So I get on that network, say there is an open FTP share that allows anonymous access. So I access that from whatever network it may be, and I'm, pilfering those file shares, looking through there, searching through, and find some credentials in plain text. It actually happens still in the real world quite often. And then once you get some credentials on an internal network, what are we doing to exploit them, to abuse them? How are we going to implement that, make it actionable during an engagement? One way is taking very low-level accounts. As long as it's a domain-connected account, we can start looking for file shares that it may have read or write access to within the domains. Looking at sysvol, which is a file share on the domain controllers themselves, searching for group policy preference files or those directories that may hold files that have passwords in them. Usually they're not in plain text. However, the key to decrypt them and decode them was leaked by Microsoft some time ago. So it's actually quite easy to reverse those out and get a plain text credential. Another great step, one of my favorites, is downloading a snapshot of Active Directory to do recon and research on throughout an engagement. Exploiting, printers, what you would call so-called, dumb devices, IoT. If they are any way domain connected, maybe there's a service account, which we'll go into here in a moment, pull that information off of there. Using those credentials to also look for local admin accounts, which quite often found in GPP. And then if you gain high enough access within the environment, copy down the NTDS file for offline cracking. So an example here, these are some of the tools you can use that we use going in and listening. The two that are shown there in these screenshots, these are not just listening, these are a little more active. What they're doing, Responder is a tool that's written in Python, so it's multi-platform. It will respond to LLMNR, NetBIOS, MDNS, and WPAD, different protocols that are set up and used predominantly by Windows systems within a domain, within an enterprise environment. What they will do is capture authentication hashes by essentially impersonating a valid or trusted object on a network and forcing a victim to send you their hash saying, hey, yes, I do need access to this, like we said earlier, this one image to render on this website. Here's my hash, please authenticate me and load it. Responder itself can do quite a bit more than that, definitely. But again, like I said earlier, that's like a whole presentation into itself. The second tool there, that's Envy. This is actually a very similar tool to Responder, but it's written in PowerShell. So say I compromise a machine within a network, I can't directly run Python on it. I can't install Python, I can't do those things there. But I can run PowerShell unrestricted. So I can push this binary over there, this PowerShell script over there, run it, and do the same type of actions there and capture these hashes, take them offline for cracking. There are other types of attacks you can do with these. You can also do an NTLM relay. So pass the hash is something I'll cover just in a moment, but NTLM v2 hashes are typically what you will get from a tool like this. These types of hashes are more complex, they're stronger, they're harder to crack, but also you can't relay them. I actually need the plain text password in order to abuse them. However, I can send and relay an NTLM v2 hash to another host, say a domain controller, to test if, hey, does this account have admin access on this system? It's a little more involved setup. You have to be very careful because it can be loud. It can lock out accounts. The other tool to mention here, and I don't have it up on this slide because I don't really have a good screenshot for it that's very clean, but there's a very passive tool called Flamingo that was developed by H.D. Moore and some of the folks there at Atreides. What it does is basically sit on a network, opens up a bunch of different listening ports, and will respond to different incoming requests. There's a lot of tools out there, a lot of software, a lot of services that will essentially spray credentials across the network. But unless you're doing, as an attacker, very detailed analysis of the packets coming through, you may not know what you're looking for, and you may not be able to decode that to use them during an engagement. But this uses some intelligence to respond back to, whatever the request may be, and say, you have some vulnerability scanner, Qualys, Nessus, what have you. This may stand up a listener, see the request come in from one of those vulnerability scanners, which if you're doing a credentialed scan, typically sends some kind of administrative account that has an elevated level of access on a machine so that it can detect different patch levels and things like that. If I can capture the password or even just a hash of that account, usually I can use that to pivot and access more machines, which that can mean game over for many different things. Another different method here, as I mentioned earlier, is finding things that are in plain text stored elsewhere. So knowing where to dig within an environment is very important as a red teamer. Different places to search, file shares, email inboxes, messaging apps. Most people in security teams are guilty of it. We're guilty of it ourselves. Sending a password to, say, a system that we have internally here. Hey, I need to log into this. Okay, cool. Here's my credentials real quick. Most of us will never go back and change those credentials and make sure those people can't log on again. It happens. People forget. We're all human. But those are great places to look. Also, machine backups that are stored on a network share. Another great place to look for things. There are some automated tools out there that can spider network shares and look for certain strings, search for, file names, or search even within, text files, things like that for passwords. But those can be very loud on the network, create a lot of traffic, can also be analyzed by their patterns, by their behavior to create alerts. And as a red teamer, that's a no-no. We don't want to create alerts because we don't want to be caught. But it can also cause, impacts on network performance because we're saturating those links with traffic searching through or slowing down a server or an endpoint because we're using so much processing or disk power to search for these things. Manually checking different shares, definitely a more intelligent and quieter way to go. It is definitely slower, and you have to be very careful with either method you choose to not access things, way far beyond your limit. So say I have a super low level account for, say, an intern, I shouldn't be trying to access super secure server 1. That may throw an alert that, hey, this person shouldn't be here. Why are they doing this? And kind of an example of a method we've used before. This is from an active pen test that I did previously, where we essentially started with no rights. We were plugged into a port in a room, which had NAC. So we were not allowed to directly just, start going. We had to bypass it, say, we were a phone or a printer or something along those lines and impersonate a different device that may be whitelisted due to MAC address or something along those lines. one of the first things we saw was a bunch of printers and VoIP phones and things like that on this one subnet. In these screenshots, you can see a setup. This was a Ricoh printer. So, large enterprise, nice printer. But a lot of these higher end devices actually tie into Active Directory to perform LDAP lookups. Say you want to scan and email that document directly to someone, or fax it, or have to do a lookup in an address book. That printer has to be able to do those things, so there has to be a domain connected account. Other times they also use FTP servers. In this case, this was set up with an FTP server. I told the printer, hey, I'm that FTP server. Why don't you go ahead and test it, your connection? And so it sent me those credentials in plain text.
Okay, so now we're going to go over some defenses for internal password exploitation. First of all, the main thing here at the top of the page is MFA. With the number of times me and my team have seen domain admin accounts, even domain admin user accounts, never having MFA enabled is pretty terrifying. And, that's generally one of the, easiest wins, enabling MFA to protect yourself against attackers. The caveat should be put out there that someone can socially engineer an MFA token out of a person, but the chance of the attacker getting that data, logging into the target in the time that MFA token is valid, it's very small, and it would have to be a hands-on keyboard approach. We could probably script it out, but that would take some time. So that's the number one defense once they have that internal password. Another thing is LAPS, Local Administrator Password Solution. It's a built-in Microsoft solution to administer the local administrator password on multiple endpoints in your environment. And it basically sets a random a minimum of 8-character random generated password, and you can set it up to whatever you want for every host name, every host in your environment. So the reason someone would want to do this is because if you have, let's say, a standard local administrator password across your whole environment, which, believe it or not, I have seen, then it just makes lateral movement so easy. You can just hop from machine to machine, and nothing's going to be triggered or alarmed. So, that's another big one. And so I know Corey talked about responders. So Responder uses LLMNR queries, right? So there's queries and responses related to the link local multicast name resolution. So you can actually log all those queries and those responses and correlate that with other system data. And then you can actually, view the exploit attempts, and then whenever you see that kind of sniffing going on your network, then you can immediately stop that. Generally there's 3 ways, right, that you can monitor sniffing, which is going on your network. One of the obvious ones is just monitoring the hosts, right? An increased CPU workload without disk usage. That's it could indicate that a sniffer is running on that machine. A lot of these tools, they run in promiscuous mode, okay? And there are generally I know for Windows there's an actual tool called Promiscuous Query, and it's for free. It's from their site, and you can actually detect any devices running in your environment in promiscuous mode. And additionally, I believe there's actually a built-in Linux command for this as well, and you'll actually see a promisc flag in the output, and you can log both the results from that Prom Query tool in Windows and from the output of that ifconfig-a. You can log that into your security logging, and you can have your analysts actually set up watch lists for that, So that's something that, you definitely have to have if you are suspicious of anyone being inside of your network and, looking for those hashes. And then the last detection method for things like Responder are generally latency. Generally, a huge amount of data is sent on the network, and the suspect machine is pinged before and after the flooding of that machine. So that's the latency detection method is another way for you to detect for that. So Corey just touched on something about IoT devices. IoT devices are, there is a whole industry in defending these things. And one of two of the easiest things you can do as a architecture or sysadmin is A, change the default credentials for these devices, but also B, having all these IoT devices on totally segmented VLANs, right? If they're not talking to other devices on the network outside of what they need to be talking to, and you can set up access controls for that, then that is your best bet. And having them off in their own segregated VLAN is also, something you absolutely need to do. The last thing where Corey was mentioning, there's passwords buried everywhere, right? So there's generally there's two approaches to removing these passwords that are run rampant in your environment. One of the ones, you can whip up a couple of PowerShell scripts that'll help you search for files named passwords, TXT or secrets or whatever. That's a free way, but then there's the expensive way is to get some kind of DLP, data leakage prevention solution. And you can, that's not only data that's leaving your network, it's also the data that's inside. And another method is information tagging, right? So on an enterprise level, there are certain solutions out there where anytime someone wants to save a Word document or save a text file, they actually have to categorize what kind of data is in that file. Meaning if it's passwords, if it's credentials, if it's API keys, it'll be, categorized as such and encrypted. So it's not, going to be available to anyone who wants to open it. So, and another thing for finding plain text creds is setting up canary passwords. So a lot of the times when you have internal applications and they're doing like debugging or logging, sometimes plain text passwords of the users interacting with those applications can get leaked, right? So if you set up let's say like a canary password of A1234 and you search that across all the log sources in your network and you're seeing this pop up, this is a really easy way for you to say, okay, it shouldn't be popping up here, it shouldn't be popping up here. So canary passwords are a pretty good way for you to defend against, creds being logged in the clear.
In something like group policy preferences, finding a local admin account, using that across the network, maybe you're sending that across an entire subnet to look for machines that it has access to, whether it be servers or workstation endpoints. In this screenshot here, you'll see I'm using a tool called CrackMap Exec. What I'm doing is checking the password first. See the little pwned indicator on the side there means I do have administrator privileges. And then I'm dumping the LSA secrets from that machine. Now, there are a lot of services and a lot of legacy systems that require high-level accounts to be set up with elevated permissions. And sometimes they still store those things in plain text, whether it be in the registry or somewhere within a file system. Highlighted in red there, even though it's blurred out, that is actually a domain administrator account or a DA account that I recovered in plain text just by finding this. So going from no permissions to a printer service account to a local admin to a domain admin. So the grand finale of the offensive side, right? You're DA, now what do you do? Move into post-exploitation. So pivoting from where we were at one point into, maybe we're doing PCI, maybe we're doing SCADA, ICS, any number of different things. If there are multiple domains, is there implicit trust between them all? Are we able to move into other areas of the enterprise? One of my favorite things to do is dump the mtds.dit file, which is an Active Directory database, if you will. It's a file that contains the credentials hashed with the NTLM algorithm, which is a very weak password hash. So it has every user account and some machine accounts that are within that domain and cracking them offline. So you can see in that screenshot there. This is me using Hashcat to crack an NTDS dump. This type of attack is a little slower. As you can see, it's only doing 116 billion guesses per second. However, there are different attack methods and different algorithms or different ways to perform these types of guesses that are quicker. And our hash cracker that I built, his name is Cthulhu, affectionately loved. It can do like 720 to 750 billion guesses per second at the high end of things. So cracking NTLM hashes, super easy. We regularly correct things that are 22, 23 characters long. Typically, that's a wordless type of deal where someone's using a commonly used passphrase or a permutation of that. But this is just a demonstration with a little bit of money. You know, any malicious actor out there can crack passwords, whether it's NTLM or any number of different hashes. Hashcat can crack all kinds of different algorithms.
Okay, and got a little amount of time left, so I'll try to go through this quickly. So to touch on Corey's point about sysvol directories, the permissions on the sysvol directory by default allow read and execute for standard user groups or accounts. So you need to ensure that the permissions on the sysvol directory do not allow greater than read and execute for standard user accounts or groups. Additionally, you need to be limiting logons to mission critical access and use a privileged access management like a secure jump box to do so. Don't let your domain admins be remoting into your critical SQL server from their regular workstation. Have that up in a virtualized monitored environment and video log those sessions and keep that data for 60 to 90 days. So just in case of an incident, a team like mine comes in, we have a lot of data that we can go and figure out exactly what happened for you. One of the things Corey talked about was NTDS cracking. So one of the ways you can do this, avoid this, is avoid using highly privileged accounts for remote interactive sessions, because when you do a console logon or an RDP or a run as, your hashes will be present in that server's memory, target server's memory, for example. So try to limit that as much as possible. And another thing that's really awesome with Windows 10 is a thing called Credential Guard. And LSAS is the process for which things like Mimikatz and stuff, it exploits the LSAS process for them to be able to dump your credentials out of memory. So Credential Guard actually runs LSAS in a virtualized container. So even with admin privileges, you can't dump creds with that protection. Now, I'm sure, if the red team is as good as ours, they can find other ways to dump those credentials, but Credential Guard on Windows 10 is an easy win for people. And then last but not least, privilege escalation monitoring, lateral movement monitoring, like east-west traffic with an intrusion detection system. Insider threat and UEBA solutions are really, really good. So your insider threat solutions should always be incorporating like normal working hours for employees, leaver lists from HR. So, just in case you have an upset employee who's about to leave, you see this leaver list pop up in your insider threat console, and you can say, these are the 12 people that will be offboarded in the next 2 weeks. So we just really need to make sure that they're not trying to exfiltrate any data that they were working on while they were employed here. And last but not least, segregate your VLANs, right? And just like Corey said, someone from finance or accounting should not be able to SSH or RDP into that SQL server VLAN, right? We do not want that. So high-level overview. So, enterprise-wide, if you can, make a push for requiring password managers. They make cracking passwords very hard when the length is, 12 or 24 characters or 20 characters plus. An initial thing is a strong password policy, no reuse, no iterations, no common passwords can be used. One other thing, don't buy more tools. You probably don't, if you're a big enterprise, you probably already have enough tools. It's just that your people aren't trained on the tools. So training is integral. And another thing, during COVID, you should know, a remote workforce is a vulnerable one. So you need to have roaming policies. So when Joe takes his laptop home, he can't access the internet for more than 10 seconds without being VPN connected. So that's a huge thing, because his behavior outside of work and outside of your network, if you don't have a roaming policy, will be a direct effect on your environment. And then,
That's right.
last but not least, last but not least, the EDR AV is your best friend. EDR collects so much information, and additionally, it enables your security team to do remote forensics, memory dumps, cruise file directories, whatever they want, without waiting to get those full-fledged images to analyze.
So to kind of wrap up here, we do appreciate everyone's participation, jumping on here and listening to us and taking part. With that, are there any other questions?